2. The Toilet Tango. Seduced at the age of 14, in a littered coppice off the A1, Hugo dropped his shorts and danced to the strains of the Toilet Tango. Well, not Hugo exactly, David. But David was Hugo. David was Hugo's cover, his protection against people who might call, people who might look for him, people who might find him round the tea table over bread and jam and a slice of cheddar cheese. And gradually David became more than that. He became the other one who wasn't quite Hugo, but did what Hugo didn't think he should. He became the naughty one, the one who dared and lied and laughed. The one who played in strange men's bedrooms, cars, offices, and kitchens. The one who didn't have a family, who didn't have any sisters, senior or junior, who didn't have any school to go to or tea to go back for. David lived to dance, and he danced them off the toilet floor. The toilet tango was not just any dance. There was no music written for it, and the steps were unrehearsed. It was a ritual of silence, interrupted by the odd mutter and the occasional inevitable grunt. But there was no one talking, and very little smiling. It was a tense, intense, often boring, but always inviting routine for two or more. You couldn't just tango in any toilet either. You had to find one with the right mood, the right people, and the right facilities. Cleanliness was a bad sign. Gleaming copper pipes and polished porcelain urinals, lovingly mopped by the man reading the racing form behind the frosted glass, meant polite piss and no dancing. Eyes might flash and teeth flash back. Men might fumble as they tucked themselves in, shaking a little too often, lingering a little too long under the notice that said, in polished blue on white, no loitering. But they always went quietly, knowing full well that no loitering meant no dancing. Dead territory. The writing was on the wall, and not all of it was polished blue on white. A few football slogans, some furious racism, a half-rubbed-off story about a man whose wife wanted 3 men in a bed and was as horny as hell, but that was 2 years ago according to the date at the bottom. No dancing there. The best places were the dark places, the neglected corner of the park, down a little back street, at the back of a car park. Dirty, but not too dirty, crowded if you were lucky. And though there, too, there were drawings on the wall, they told a different story. Football toughs and smouldering racists gave way to sexual hermits, dreaming up lurid concoctions of age and gender while waiting in silence behind the cubicle door. David never drew on any wall, but, like Hugo with his stolen porn mags, he read their contents avidly. And if there were enough, if the stories were dated and the dates were recent, if the ink was still unfaded, unscrubbed, then he knew if he showed a little patience and a little self-control, someone would come in. He had to be careful with the stories, careful not to get too turned on, not to finish before anything had started, not to come before anyone had arrived. Some of the stories were very good, some were very ordinary. Tales of incestuous couplings with teenage cousins and sons and daughters, with policemen who demanded servicing, with lorry drivers who took 16-year-old skinheads on long-distance rides. Tales of men with books and videos, with poppers and rubber sheets, with their own place. Boasts from and demands for men with dicks of mythical dimensions. Confessions of men with no shame who wanted to be beaten, pissed on, shat on, abused like a slave, like a dog. There were often complaints about age. Where are all the young boys? Angry messages moaning about the old man who loitered unwanted in the corner, staring and winking, spurned without remorse. The old man who, taking their own turn, snuck into the cubicles and scribbled, in old-fashioned handwriting, penciled stories about lacy underwear and old photos. David swore at the old man. Hugo felt sorry for them. But the old men had no shame. Why should they have? They'd seen their own flush of youth addle into liver spots. They'd seen every proud little cock tease reject them when there was action, but come on to them when there was nothing around, and they were too randy to hold it in. Some of the messages were for the older men only. Young men who wanted a mature master, an older guy for caring and sharing. But mostly it was the young for the young. Harry, 22-year-old, wants big cock fun with butch-type skinhead, 18 to 22, new in area, own place, Jen, 7, 5, 74. For some time, David puzzled over who Jen was, the ubiquitous tango expert who appeared on every wall, in every suburb, in different handwriting, always making offers and requests, numbers. He'd lived through every combination of every copulation and wanted more. He was available between these hours here and those hours there. It was a disappointment to realize that Jen meant genuine, a disappointment not only to find that a man of such prowess did not exist, but that what was left in his place was the pathos of doubt, the fear of rejection, of being ignored, of being one of the old men. But then the walls were full of meetings unmet, of hours wasted and appointments missed. David never kept his own appointments. The men always wanted a second shot. They never understood that David's time was limited by Hugo's parents, and by Hugo himself. Even as David came, shooting across the eiderdown or counterpane, making his partner nervous and sticky, he began to fade away. The sassy street urchin who knew what he wanted, and wanted it now, in the mouth and in the bedroom, dissolved like a mirage, into an irritable, shy, twitchy Hugo, annoyed because another afternoon had trickled away in wasted hours spent hanging out at the urinal, waiting to stick his dick in a stranger's mouth. It might be his dick, but David was looking after it. And what did he have to show for the afternoon? Nothing. At best, a couple of pounds that he'd blow at the school tuck shop the next day. At worst, a love bite he had to hide, and a stain he had to scrub off. Hugo might try to blame David, but they both knew they were stuck in the grip of this push-me-pull-you partnership. Hugo handed over to David almost as soon as they were out of the front door. Just as he couldn't walk into a shop without wanting to shoplift, he couldn't walk into the open air without wanting to have sex. No matter what cultural tour of museums and libraries Hugo may have planned, David would not leave him alone until he had been satisfied. Trips to the National Gallery or the British Museum ended up in Leicester Square, staring at mermaids on the sea-green toilet tiles as the man at the next urinal worked up an erection or hurried off. Visits to matinee performances of set-text classics were spent earning pound notes being sucked by a bearded foreigner in the disused lift shaft of an underground car park on Panton Street. Of course, had Hugo been saddled with sex in the wooden loo down the A1 in South Mims for the rest of his adolescence, none of this might have happened. Desire might have succumbed to laziness. The cycle ride fueled by anticipation was hard enough, but the ride back, energy spent, guilt growing, was hard, and the hills were long and slow. That problem was solved by the local council. They handed Hugo a dance parlor, a tea room, a cottage, right on his own doorstep. That was the beginning of David's real career. That was the beginning of everything. South Mims was wild beyond belief, and soon after burnt to the ground. What might have ended with that fire instead found succor in suburbia. It started on a Friday night. Hugo was on his way to Woodcroft Folk. He had joined Woodcroft Folk because his older sister had. She had joined Woodcroft Folk because she couldn't stand the twittering bitching of the girl guides, whose conversation stretched from lipstick and eyeshadow to whom David Rees had snogged last week, or the pimple on the end of Suzanne's nose. Hugo's sister didn't wear lipstick or eyeshadow. She wasn't allowed to. She didn't know David Rees. She wasn't allowed boyfriends, and she had her own pimples to worry about. She couldn't swap gossip with her friends about last Saturday night's snog or giggle as she planned next week's snog, because she didn't have any friends and she wasn't allowed to go to parties. For all Hugo knew or cared then, she had probably never snogged. She was never asked to parties anyway, because she wasn't a laugh. Hugo thought that was her fault. He never realized how unhappy she must be. He just thought that she was bad-tempered. His sister had left Girl Guides and started looking for adolescent salvation. On her way to God, she tumbled across the Woodcroft Folk, and a very different collection of girls and boys. After the endless Union Jacks of guiding and scouting, this was the red flag of youth groups, where everyone smoked roll-ups and joints, collected Jimi Hendrix records, and had fucked at least once. Hugo knew they had fucked before because they liked talking about it so much. The girls knew of teenage pregnancies that had been aborted. The boys had friends who were fathers before O-levels were through. Hugo followed his sister because he, too, was on the run from Baden-Powell and badges and church parade. Like his sister, Hugo didn't fit in. Not that the cubs stood around talking about blue eyeshadow and boys. They didn't even talk about girls. They talked about football, and they liked getting muddy. Hugo left when he was expected to become a real scout. There was nothing he wanted to be less. Cubs had been okay. He knew the boys there from the primary school on the hill. He saw them every day. They knew who he was, and they knew what he was like. They didn't expect anything odd from him. They knew he was no good at collecting badges, which he was supposed to do, and he wasn't very keen on British Bulldog. But that was fine because nobody minded. At Scouts, people minded. They started shouting at you. The teasing was harder and nastier. The boys bigger, stranger, and crueler. The leaders were not there to protect you, but to throw you in at the deep end. It was all part of being a man. Hugo had no interest in that. One year his parents had sent him to weekend camp at Well End. He could have told them before he went that it would be dreadful. Even the list of regulation clothing and equipment read like a military order. The camp was littered with retired army people who missed their uniforms and were prepared to wear a woggle and shorts so they could get back into the khaki and shout at a few minions. Hugo had no aptitude for being shouted at. This was clear to him when he got stuck during rock climbing. It wasn't really rock climbing at all. The rock was a tall wooden wall with little ledges nailed on it. You had to tie yourself up with ropes attached above and below to real scouts in beige uniforms and long trousers, and then you had to climb. Hugo could climb rocks easily enough, but not sheer planks of wood while being shouted at. He didn't respond to the shouts. He just stared at the wood in front of him and didn't move. He was pinned to the spot by panic. He looked down, waiting to jump. The faces below him were divided between the boys who hated him because he was a weed and the boys who hated him because they were weeds too. That was the whole weekend, the whole point of the weekend, an assault course at which boys like Hugo fell and other boys laughed at them. Hugo missed his little sister so badly, he would have let her play any game she wanted just to have her with him. They could have run off into the woods and played houses. All the camp games were about making war, about getting wet and muddy, getting your itchy green sweater torn in fights, getting a cut and a couple of bruises, and smiling through it all. That was the sign that you knew how to play. That night he cried with shame and discomfort on his brand new regulation ground sheet in a sweaty little tent with 2 other cubs and several mosquitoes. He almost cried with rage the next morning when they announced tent inspection. All the clothes his mother had so neatly folded had to be unpacked, unfolded, and laid out in the drizzle to be inspected by a fat man in khaki. Each carefully folded and ironed sock or shirt or handkerchief made him think of his mother, of the 2 of them, just him and her, sitting in his bedroom packing his bag and talking. All these clothes were his last link with her. She had been the last one to touch them, pushing them down in the rucksack without unfolding or creasing them. Now they had to be exposed to the fat man with the whistle round his neck. On that day he conceived a cold, speechless loathing for loud men in uniform. He wanted to spit in the eye of the fat man with the whistle and tell him how stupid he looked standing there bollocking little boys in a muddy field on Sunday morning. When his parents came to collect Hugo from Well End, they didn't seem annoyed that he hadn't enjoyed himself, which surprised him because they'd had to pay for the holiday, and they were normally very strict about making proper use of money. After camp, it was clear to Hugo that he wasn't going to go into the Scouts, so he told his parents he wanted to go to Woodcraft Folk with his sister instead. There were no badges at Woodcraft Folk, except the one of the campfire burning you got when you joined. There were country dancing and political debates, and no British Bulldog or tests on knots. There were coffee breaks with biscuits. There was laughter and friendliness. But to begin with, Hugo, still shy and uncertain, lurked, shirking the spotlight that his serious-minded sister drew upon them both. Besides which, Hugo was always late for meetings. Not to begin with, but as the weeks went by, he'd arrive sometimes 40 minutes after the beginning of the evening. His sister always looked puzzled. Hugo would blame it on his bike, or leaving home late, or being held up somehow. But he'd never tell her the truth. The truth about why he'd never had to go to South Mims again. The truth about the council who had given David his very own place to play in so close to home. It was all accidental again, really. Although Hugo had his suspicions, even as he walked up the chipped path to the open door. He was cycling on his way to Woodcroft Folk, and he decided he needed a piss. Whether he saw the loo first and then thought, why not? Or whether he really wanted one, and the loo was just there at the right time, doesn't matter now. But the truth is that unless he was bursting, which was unlikely because he had only just left home, he could have saved it for the 5 minutes it would have taken him to get to the meeting. He wasn't giving in to his bladder, but to David. David couldn't walk past a loo without investigating. It was like sweet shops had been for Hugo and his sister. They couldn't walk out without having stolen something. And it was like the drinks cabinet at home when his parents went out. He had to have a go, an inch off one bottle and half an inch off another, if only because it was there. It was odd that he'd never noticed the loo before. It was tucked away in a little corner of the high street, wedged between a pub and some derelict houses hidden behind billboards. It was a perfect cottage, semi-secluded, but with good parking and a strong flow past of accidental customers. Victorian architecture allowing for the right degree of decay. Wooden doors with holes, dim lighting, 50-odd years of graffiti. No space for an attendant, and within easy reach of the shops, allowing for an endless variety of excuses to cover an endless variety of visits. Inside it was dark and damp. There was a smell in the air Hugo recognized but had never been able to place. He recognized it from other toilets, but not all toilets. It was not a smell of piss or shit. It was a smell of sex. Stale sex. One of the cubicle doors was closed. There were only two, and Hugo quietly slipped into the other, leaving his bike parked against the stained tiles opposite the urinals. There was no doubting this place. The stories were frenzied and exciting. The drawings were exaggerated and had been added to by many different pens on many different afternoons. But there was something extraordinary about this cottage. There was a hole in the wall between the two cubicles, a hole in a metal wall. This hole hadn't been drilled or gouged out. This hole was in the metal and had always been there. It was at just the right height, so if Hugo sat on the toilet seat in one cubicle, he could see the hands of the man masturbating in the next. He crouched down and looked up until he caught a glimpse of the face staring back at him. There was a protocol about walls with holes of this size, a protocol everybody knew even though such holes were rare and rarely lasted long, usually being boarded up by diligent toilet maintenance men. Depending on what you saw when you looked up through the hole to the face of the man in the cubicle next to you, you either curtained the hole with a sheet of wetted toilet paper, or you put your finger through the hole and wiggled it. The first message couldn't have been clearer. The second message was a formal invitation to the man next door to stick his dick through the hole. This was not always easy, especially if, like Hugo, you were very tall. Although the hole was perfect for sightlines, it was at a very inconvenient height for anyone who didn't have very short legs. But with knees bent and belly pressed against the cold, bumpy paint of the institution blue wall, you managed somehow, for the sake of that first shivering sensation of warm, strange lips, and a warm, strange tongue closing over the end of your dick. Standing outside by the stained tiles and the chipped urinals, waiting for a cubicle to become empty, David could sometimes hear the first faint gasp of pleasure as one man's mouth reached another man's prick. Of course, there had been a hole at South Mims, many holes in fact, but this place was on Hugo's doorstep. It had always been there. He had walked past it 1,000 times. It was opposite the bread shop, where twice a week on holidays he collected the bread. It was opposite the office block he had watched being built from the windows of his parents' sitting room. David wanted to hang around, to lure the man from his cubicle. David wanted to take over, but Hugo had to get to Woodcroft Folk, and his sister coffee and biscuits and country dancing. He shouldn't be here now, he thought, as he bent down and looked through the hole at the hands of the man masturbating in the next cubicle. In the darkness he could see his body lean forward and peer back through the hole at Hugo's blinking eye. Hugo stood up quickly. He was breathless. He opened the cubicle door and went back to his bicycle. He was halfway down the high road before he looked back. Standing at the end of the little path, staring after him, was a dark-haired man of medium height. He never saw that man again. There was life in and out of cottages, strangers' faces, sex for 10 minutes with a man whose name you never asked and never saw again. Only a few turned up again and again, like David. If Hugo hadn't found this 24-hour tango parlor right on his doorstep, his life might have been different. But now, alerted to the fact that such pleasure palaces lurked on high streets across suburbia, Hugo, David, and the bicycle became a three-way conspiracy. They made a great team. Hugo did the lying, the oiling of the domestic waters. He played on his mother's prejudices and snobberies, inventing stories about trips into London that never happened. And when they did, were not spent as he said they were. Today it was an art gallery, tomorrow a library. She never asked him what he'd seen. Secretly, he wondered how much she guessed, how much she knew, how much he feared but didn't want to find out. He had had some close shaves. Once, driving up the hill in the front seat of the strange man's car, he saw his father's car approaching. He ducked in his seat without saying anything to the man next to him, who stared at him in surprise. Afterwards, Hugo felt terrible pangs of remorse. His father had been smiling, probably listening to the radio. The fact that he could have had no idea that Hugo was in the car going in the opposite direction, calling himself David and wearing his pants round his ankles, made him feel sorry. Sorry for his father. Sorry that he had been so bad. 10 minutes later, David was spread-eagled on the front seat down a quiet lane, the man next to him chomping at his groin as a smile flickered about David's lips. His brief flirtation with conscience had been quashed by lust. It wasn't long after that David, spread-eagled once more in another car with a different man, gazed dreamily through the car window as the sensation of a strange mouth massaging his groin flooded his thighs and belly with pleasure, and looked into the wide, painted eyes of an old lady. Her lips were parted in a grimace of shock, and he could see where the lipstick had smudged onto her front teeth. She was out walking her dog, and had stopped to peer into the car. Her nosiness had not prepared her for this, however. She was transfixed. David smiled at her. She walked away, and he watched her reflection in the wing mirror as he heaved a load of pent-up spunk into the driver's mouth. The driver had had no idea what was happening. The lady was writing down the car's registration number in her address book, while her poodle sat on the verge. The driver, David never knew his name, he never knew any of their names, didn't notice. He was probably visited by police later. That wouldn't have occurred to David. He had no idea how illegal he was. He was always irritated by people's fears. Scared men were so uneasy, so difficult. He didn't understand why they were so scared. He thought that if anyone was taking the risk, it was him. If someone had asked him straight off whether what he was doing was illegal, and if so, under what law, he might have known that there was an age limit on sex, at somewhere like 16. But he probably wouldn't have known that he couldn't have sex for another 7 years, and it certainly never dawned on him that all the men he had lured and cajoled and bullied into sex, and although not all of them needed cajoling, all of them seemed wary, were potentially at least the same men in the papers who were locked up after humiliating trials in courtrooms, surrounded by hysterical mothers and troublemakers. It was only much later that he realized that the Playland scandals of Leicester Square saw men he knew, if not by name, at least by smile and address and shape of cock, locked up until the end of the next ice age. In the rough and tumble and 2 quid for chocolates after of David's sex life, he had been blissfully unaware that his sexual appetite could spell the end of someone's perfectly civilized, chintz and glass ornamented life, that he was like a black widow capable of administering not death, but worse, torture as a nonce in a British jail. And although he was never a blackmailer, and not interested in fear, the danger would have given him an instant hard-on, had he known. The fun was having sex in front of people who couldn't see you, or people who could have done but just didn't look. There was the time David was lying in the scraggly brush of local woodland with a bulky merchant seaman whose lorry was parked up the road when a gaggle of mothers and pushchairs went by. They didn't stop. They didn't even look. Neither did the mothers. And there were his trysts in the disused car park lift shaft off Panton Street, which, if anyone had cared to look over the fence at the top where the shaft reached the open air, would have revealed a man and a boy with their trousers round their knees, locked in a clinch, the one feeding off the other's hanging fruit. The whole eroticism of thinly veiled seduction and thinly concealed sex led David to bolder and better coups. He collected men. No, he collected incident. He could trap someone in the street with a look, have him turn around, abandoning any shopping or errands he may have had to do or run, and trawl him back to a lair, a cottage, an alley, a dark corner. Even sometimes in the heat and dust of summers, simply a secluded corner of an open park. The cottage was also his refuge, the beehive which the drones were guaranteed to visit. It was his holiday home, his weekend retreat, his refreshment stop on the way to and from home and the shops, home and the library, home and school. And all the time, Hugo, who may have disapproved of David's more unorthodox maneuvers, protected him, piling the lies on thicker and thicker. The bicycle provided the perfect cover, with its connotations of healthy pursuits, but cycle rides took whole afternoons. For quicker visits, Hugo devised snappier alibis and took advantage of every opportunity. The dentist or the doctor or a shopping errand, each of them allowed for quick visits. And if he was late, Hugo blamed it all on errant buses and supermarket queues. Hugo worked hard to keep David happy, although they seemed to have less and less in common. David was terse, sometimes even rude. He preferred to appear tough, even dirty. Hugo was shy, where David was brazen, and yet talkative, where David was sullen. And for all David's street-tough masquerade, it was Hugo who frightened people. David was always looking for people with a place. People with their own places were the best, because then the fun could go on for longer, could be wilder, could be naked and out of control. He loved trampling naked across the domestic landscape, the siren dragging his victim into the pit. But once sex was over, and a spent David dissolved, leaving tense and testy Hugo in his place, David's catchers were unnerved to find an intelligent, nicely spoken local boy in their house. It was as if they felt they had less to fear from the tough little tyke who might blackmail them than from the nice local schoolboy who might tell his parents and remember the address. But if Hugo was the wise one, David was the expert. He knew every cottage and all the regulars. He hated the regulars. Most of them had him once. He didn't like having people more than once unless there was something special or they had a place. He was always waiting for the glorious stranger, the big, tanned, hairy man. The insipid moths of cottage life, who spent their afternoons, like his, wandering from cubicle to cubicle, cottage to cottage, the lip-licking creatures in the too-tight t-shirts, weren't what he wanted. They were just what he got, most of the time. The Hadley find, between the pub and the billboards, led to others across town, up hills and down streets Hugo had known all his childhood. Within weeks, David knew every hole in every doorway, which one looked over the urinal and the row of rising and falling dicks, which one gave the sweep of profiled faces, chins, sagging jaws, running noses, baggy eyes, which one panned the waiting line, leaning against the stained tiles, for the cubicles to change over. He knew the hours, too. There were peak times for cottages, and long, dull, empty times. Early mornings were busy, when men emerged from their households, suited, washed, shaved, and horny, looking for a blowjob before the bus ride, before the 9 o'clock meeting. Something to take the pressure off. Lunchtime in the high street was hot but cautious. People were randy but worried about their jobs. Nobody knew who else was about. There was no getting into cars in the daylight. Hugo didn't like that either. His mother and his mother's friends shopped at the supermarket, and all the little greengrocers, stationers, butchers, and delis lined up along the high street. They were in and out, eyes sparkling, teeth bared, looking for gossip. It was bad enough that they had seen Hugo and his sister shoplifting at Waitrose. There was no need for them to see him in a strange car with a strange man taking off for a strange house. If he did get into a car, he sat on the floor until they were safely through the danger zone. In-between times could be boring. An empty cottage might hold great potential, but usually meant long hours standing still, waiting with the flotsam, the old men who could loiter and dribble away their hours with such patience that David would end up wanking in front of them as if they weren't there, or as if they were some distant audience. He felt like a stripper toiling and sweating under cheap strip lighting or broken-down lampshades, with under-wattage bulbs in front of a gathering of old men, straining for the relief of an orgasm which, when it came, was only a spasm, without the shudder, an anticlimax that offered no feeling of relief, just a small grey wave of depression. But David liked to have an audience, even if it was the despised old men he wouldn't let touch him. He was a rarity in the tea dance, tango parlor world, a teenager with a big cock and lascivious mind, who'd play without inhibition, who'd get in your car and come in your house without tears or fears. And Hugo was pretty, so David could persuade his playmates, his partners, to do the things they knew they shouldn't so near to the crowded pavement, to the respectable citizenry passing by, to the police station, and to long prison sentences. That summer, that first summer of woodcraft and sex, David devoted hours of Hugo's life to the toilet tango. Standing by the cracked pane of wire-reinforced glass, peering at the passing traffic, at an outside world framed by the jagged edges of a dirty window, he'd wait for a customer, a bait, a prospect. He'd see them coming up the path and suddenly stiffen into the camouflage of one just finishing or just starting a pee. If it was someone he recognized and loathed, he'd put himself away and either hide in the cubicle or lean arrogantly against the wall, neither pissing nor shitting, waiting, but obviously not for them. He enjoyed that pose. He felt like a drug dealer with good protection. He felt mean and streetwise. He felt in control. If it was a new face, he'd stand and shake his penis as if finishing a pee, while his eyes peered out of their corners, watching for the telltale signs. The one stroke too many, the eyes glancing down along the urinal, quick and furtive, the hunch of the shoulders, the wariness. With most people, David could tell very quickly if they were pissing or playing. The ordinary passers-by ignored the tension, ignored the eyes, were too casual. Whistling, they sauntered in and out, preoccupied, sometimes hurrying, worried about the bus down the road, or the wife outside, or the children waiting in the street with the Saturday shopping, and normal life briefly falling under the watchful eyes of an underworld. The ordinary men even pissed differently. They would stand leaning into the urinal as they peed, the gurgle in the drains warning the bystanders to be wary. With a slight moan, a slight shudder of relief, they would shake, zip up, and leave, eyes never wandering, mission never diverted. The presence of such a stranger would cause ripples of imitative behavior from the waiting, watching cottage men. All the masturbating penises would stop masturbating and shake vigorously, miming the jerks and brisk movements of the intruder. If the urinal was against the wall, and not in little self-contained bowls, all the erect dicks, swollen with half an hour's toying and tweaking, would be pushed down, until almost parallel with the body, as their owners stared at them, as if astonished to see that they still weren't peeing. And these same waiting, watching cottagers, David's partners in the secret dances behind the broken glass windows, among the soggy bog rolls, would switch back as quickly to their dance positions the minute the intruder was gone. The whole cast list was so perfectly trained, no matter how little they felt they belonged. And like all good tangos, like all good carnivals, the cast list was varied and colourful. Married men on the run from loneliness, who took David to high-rise apartments, peachy with the smells of female laundry, and did sex with him on the marital bed before fleeing, ducking the gaze of fascinated neighbours. Quiet men living in solitary confinement in suburban backwaters with untended gardens and unhoovered carpets, whose lives revolved around the television, the music for pleasure record collection, and the fridge. Builders who did it in secret corners on site. Local half-wits whose penises had drained their brains of vital blood. Office workers dying to rip open their waistcoats. Men whose faces flushed red in blotches when they came, who gasped and leaked a dribble of sperm after half an hour of sweating and panting. Men with small floppy dicks, men with hard-cut dicks, men with dicks that bent to the left or to the right or dribbled too much before they came, and very occasionally men who begged to be thrashed with the belt and made to lick his shoes. The game was easy at first, while Hugo was so young and David so fearless and hungry. Even when the situations became bizarre, the car journeys too long, or the men too strange, and the danger too close, David smiled through his apprehension, clinging to the hope of an orgasm at someone else's hand, with someone else's body there to touch. Sometimes he lost it. He lost it with the man in the woods who asked him to take his trousers off and hung them on a fence next to the railway track, and then asked him to take his underwear off, and did the same with that, and then tried to ram, not slide or work or glide or slip his dick into David's arse. David was shocked to hear Hugo scream and vanished, leaving Hugo bleating like a baby, clinging to the man whose name he didn't know. David never asked their names, even when they asked his. After all, he was lying, so why shouldn't they? And what could he do with a false name? Sometimes he just dumped Hugo in it. He dumped Hugo in it with the old man down the street. And he really dumped him in it with the sickness in his dick that hurt when he peed and leaked pus into his underpants. What frightened Hugo about the old man was that people were obviously talking about David, but thinking it was him. He was being marked out, and David wasn't helping. Normally, he wouldn't have known about the old man. He would never have spoken to him if his mother hadn't been too busy cooking for guests who were coming to dinner, and had had time to go out and do her charity collecting, and hadn't decided to send Hugo instead, giving him a list of doorbells to ring and names to ask for, and a little speech to say, which she had made him rehearse over and over in the kitchen, getting the begging bits in the right place. Hugo never wanted to do his mother's collecting, but he was still on his school holidays and didn't seem to be doing much, just fiddling about. And once an idea like that was in her head, Hugo didn't really have a chance. He just had the option of accepting gracefully and going into credit or being bolshy and getting shouted at. The end result was the same. So he was out doorstepping, meeting all the old ladies down the street who remembered when he was just so high and stood reminiscing in mumbles and dribbles as he stared past them at their dark hallways with dried flowers and long mirrors, waiting for their old stiff fingers to find the coins in their stiff old purses. He was doing quite well. They all remembered his name, and when he was a baby, although they saw him every day and walked right past him, muttering into their beards. They all had the money ready in their purses and didn't want to talk any more than just to give their regards to his mother, who was such a nice lady. He was doing very well. He might even be finished in time to watch some television before his sisters came home from school, and it was tea time. Then he came to number 7. He knew that the lady at number 7 was the one with dark hair and the flame-red lipstick smudged across her lips as if she'd been smacked in the mouth and didn't care anyone who saw. She wore a blue headscarf and walked at great speed, talking all the time, sometimes shouting, always alone. She wasn't the only mad woman on the street, but she was the only one who didn't drink, so she was feared more than loathed by the ladies of the Union Church, who twitched their net curtains as she walked past. The mad lady at number 7 lived with her brother. Hugo had seen him in the street in a somber gabardine and somber hat. He had a thin face and watery eyes to match a watery smile. He wasn't someone Hugo had really noticed. Like all old men, his clothes were the grey-green of the houses and the pavements, the colourless patina of suburbia, and he just blended in. It was her brother who answered the door when Hugo rang, and he stood there smiling his watery smile as Hugo delivered his little speech. When Hugo had finished, the old man started talking, and at first Hugo didn't listen because he was talking so quietly. Besides, Hugo was staring over his shoulder, looking for a glimpse of smudged flame lipstick and mad eyes. Then he noticed that the look in the old man's swimming eyes was the wrong look. It wasn't the look of a kindly old sir who wanted to tell Hugo a few stories. The way he was grinning, the way he was staring, made Hugo listen to him. And then he realized that the old man was talking about David and the toilet at the top of the hill. "I hear you're a clever boy," he smiled. "You must come and show me how clever you really are." Hugo stared hard at him, nodded, mumbled, and backed off down the drive. He felt squeamish with the look of the man still on his neck. He felt terrified that someone might have seen or heard. Number 7 was only a few yards from his parents' house, and if the old man knew all about the top of the hill games, they couldn't be far from knowing themselves. Hugo hated the old man. He wanted revenge. All the man had done was to invite Hugo to come back another day, for games in the black space behind his front door, but Hugo was angry with himself, because when the man had invited him, he had smiled. Smiled because he wasn't really listening and couldn't really hear until it was too late. By the time he had understood what the man was saying, he had already smiled at him, the normal polite smile of Mrs. Harvey's son from over the road, instead of flashing him something altogether nastier from David. What worried him the most was that the man might think his smile was an acceptance. No, that wasn't true. What frightened him even more than that was that the man only had to cross the road and ring the doorbell, and he could tell Mrs. Harvey the whole story about her nice charity-collecting son and his dick. Hugo hated the old man because his eyes ran and his mouth leered. He hated him because he was old. He was one of the men in the corner, watching and waiting, as the younger men came and went. Like insects crawling out from behind the stained tiles, the old men were slimed with the damp stench of the soggy bogrel world. Before, none of them had known anything about Hugo or David, but now one of them lived in Hugo's world. David had let one of them in, and every day he had to pass this man who knew his dirty secrets, and every day he wanted to spit in his eye. He wanted to spit in the eye of the young man with the shaved pubes as well, the young man with the black curly hair and the thin white polo neck sweater, who had let an old man watch, wanking, as he and Hugo had sex in his bed in his apartment. The young man who had made pissing painful. When it first started to hurt, Hugo put it down to an acidic stomach. He didn't really know what an acidic stomach was or what it entailed, but the first and the second time it hurt, he thought that was what it must be. The third time the pain was so bad he had to bite his hand, so one pain cancelled the other. His stomach didn't feel acidic. He felt faint. Over the next 2 days, the bite marks in his hand got deeper. Then the white stuff started appearing at the end of his dick. By this time, Hugo really suspected that he had what at school they called VD, but he couldn't be sure because Where Do Babies Come From didn't have any illustrations or descriptions, and the encyclopedia didn't give you the symptoms, just the history. But he guessed it must be because of what had happened in the flat of the young man with the shaved pubes. Hugo met the man with the shaved pubes at the top of the hill cottage, and had gone back to his flat in Finchley. It was a bedsit with big windows, a carpet that didn't fit at the edges, and an old bedstead. Next to the bedstead there was a mean little basin by Armitage Shanks and a pair of dirty tooth mugs. In the middle of the ill-fitting carpet stood an old man with glasses and trousers round his knees. Hugo couldn't remember when the old man appeared, and he couldn't remember being surprised when he did appear, or was suddenly there. They had done a deal in whispers behind the door while David paced the room, and probably the man had sneaked in when David was naked and in the bed. It was a good plan, because once David was started, nothing was going to stop him. Except this time it really wasn't much fun, because the man in the white pullover wanted David to fuck him, and David had never fucked before. One thing he noticed about fucking was that you had to concentrate very hard to keep it interesting. Otherwise your dick went soft and slipped out with an unerotic slurp. David liked men's chests. He liked pectorals and the line of the hair running from the belly button down into the groin. Backs left him cold. Kneeling behind the bent-over body of a young man, pummeling into him while noticing how many blackheads grew in the pale and sweaty furrows of his back, left his erection up only out of habit, not out of any desire. He was fucking the man just as he might have washed the dishes. He wasn't even sure that the man he was fucking was having a good time. His grunts sounded pedestrian, predictable. They left the sexual temperature of the occasion flickering near freezing. The only person Hugo could tell was having a good time was the old man. The old man stood in the middle of the carpet, panting, his glasses steamed up. David glanced across at him and frowned, concentrating on the rhythm he had to keep going under the sheets, feeling his thighs tire and the sweat prickle on the back of his neck. Hugo was nagging at him to give up and go. The old man winked and gasped, watched as his dick dribbled white spots onto the carpet and, rubbing them in with his slipper, left the room. David tensed his stomach and bullied the arse of the quietly grunting young man. He felt no tenderness, no desire, no need to touch the body or fondle it. With other men's bodies, real and imagined, rotating in front of his half-closed eyes, David finally managed to sink into orgasm, and that at least was good. Ejaculating into the hidden inner spaces of a man's body felt strange, out of control but contained. He shuddered and withdrew, making that horrible slurping suction sound again. The young man farted. Hugo was furious. He had to leave. He was disgusted at the sight of his dick soiled with shit, washing it in the mean basin, standing on tiptoe and pouring hot water over it with one of the dirty tooth mugs. He felt sure something wrong had happened. The young man slept. All Hugo wanted was to be back, safe in the clutches of his family, reading his book in an armchair before being called for tea. He walked fast the whole way back and muttered the whole time, "Oh no, 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 how dare he? No. But Hugo couldn't simply sink back into the armchair and forget, because now every time he peed, it took him 10 minutes to recover enough to leave the loo, and even then he was whey-faced and dizzy. What could he do? What did one do? He knew it was dangerous to do nothing. His mother had always made his doctor's appointments for him. Maybe he should try boots, but how did you explain to the lady in boots, who sat in a prominent pew in the Union Church on Sunday mornings, that your willy was giving off white stuff and hurt like hot pins every time you pissed? How did you tell her about the split second of hope between the first trickle of piss and the first pain, a tiny second when he thought that maybe it was all over? Now even that second had gone. The pain was there gently, but insistently the whole time. How could you tell her all that in a queue of Hadley mothers, each one of them knowing that 14-year-old Hugo was in the Cubs with Paul, and at primary school with Johnny, and now at big school with Michael and Simon? Eventually, the story had to come out. The pain became too bad to hide. Hugo's mother found him in the bedroom with his head hung between his knees and his trousers round his ankles, clutching his penis and weeping. She sat next to him and put an arm round him, and he sobbed his pain out. She rang the doctor straight away, and he went that afternoon. It wasn't his normal doctor when he got there. He was on holiday, so Hugo saw an old lady with silver hair who examined him with cellophane gloves. She asked him no questions, gave him no words of warning. She just looked, squeezed, dabbed, and smeared. Then she wrote him a prescription. Hugo could still remember those pills 15 years later. They were red and black and called Pemberton. They were angels in capsules. She must have been a saint, this lady doctor. She never asked to speak to Hugo's parents. She never brought the matter up again. She just wrote in rather elegant longhand, with a fountain pen, the word gonorrhea on Hugo's card. Hugo never knew whether his mother tried to find out from the doctor what was wrong with him, but he knew that the family had talked about it among themselves, and the verdict from Maidenhead, where Hugo had a grandmother he liked and an aunt he couldn't stand, was that he must have had cystitis. David was dismayed, but not discouraged by the setback, although fucking joined two already forbidden practices on his dance card. David, for all his daring, would not let men put their tongues in his mouth or their penises in his bottom. He had banned penises on all counts, but the truth was that the pain was too much. He had banned tongues from the very beginning, and even he was not sure why. There was something about the face to face, mouth to mouth that frightened him. It was just too close. David liked sex to be taut and tense. Kissing was intimate in a way that troubled him. Blowjobs were fine, of course. If they wanted to bend and eat as he looked down on them, he would smile and lean back against the cold, bumpy wall, pulling his t-shirt up over his stomach, still tanned and skinny, and smile. If they wanted him to eat and suck and bite them, he would, and willingly. He flew at their nipples, their bellies, and all the hairy confusion of their bowls. But the mouth-to-mouth was out. He shrank away as the tongues probed his lips, turning his head so they sucked his ears. He shrank away, and the men looked hurt and surprised, annoyed. What was wrong with the little tart? Did they have bad breath? Did he have something to hide? Weren't they good enough for him? Maybe that was it. Maybe, of all the men he had been with, he had always chosen them for their bodies, not for their faces and their mouths and lips. And adventurous tongues were allowed to play across his body, but not to touch his virgin mouth. David didn't know. Maybe it was simply a question of virginity. Maybe it was waiting for the right lover. The right lover came in the end, over the wall between the two cubicles in the cottage at the top of the hill, and lowered himself, lithe and hairless, shirtless too, into David's realm. He smiled as he looked David straight in the eyes, and without a word he took David's head between his hands and kissed him. He pushed his tongue between David's lips and past his teeth, and suddenly David's mouth was wide open and full of swirling, soft, non-stop tongue. He leaned back against the wall, and the man leaned towards him, pushing his way further into David's mouth as he swooned unstruggling in the sweet pleasure. They didn't stop kissing, it seemed, until both had come, and the queue of irritated men leaning against the stained tiles reached almost out of the door. The strange, hairless man climbed over the wall again and disappeared. David opened his door and, a smile still playing around the corners of his lips, walked past the irritable queue, chin up and eyes forward. Both David's dance card bands were broken by force. David's mouth lost its virginity to a man whose name he never knew, but whose muscles and smile were bathed in a romantic afterglow like some chevalier coming to the rescue of a lonely maiden. Hugo summoned him for wank fantasies on long, boring evenings, wrestling with the sex lies of amoeba and Spirogara. David watched for him in cottages from Hadley to Barnet. Neither of them ever saw him again. The first man to squeeze his prick into David's bottom occupied a very different corner of Hugo's mind. The thin man was no fantasy. He was the real bog-roll species, the toilet regular, what you were left with after a long, lonely wait. The first man to squeeze his prick into David's bottom did it in the right-hand cubicle of the top of the hill cottage, on a rainy afternoon when nobody seemed to be about. David knew him by sight, as he knew many in his strange collection of regulars. He knew the scoutmaster from Ponder's End, who would always be waiting there at 5 p.m. on Sunday afternoons, waiting to drive him off to a little suburban flat for an hour of rolling, slapping, sucking, bouncing sex for which Hugo would be given £2. He knew the fat man who was so round he had to move slowly in the confined space of the hillside tea room, who took David for rides in a grubby van down secluded lanes, who parked the van in leafy laybys and bent over David's groin as David lifted his shirt and stared at the great white corpulence spreading underneath. He knew the denim man with the tattooed earlobes, and the wet-lipped man with the curved prick who hung around the loos at the open-air swimming pool. He knew the round-bellied man who rubbed his body against David's by a brook as gnats bit their buttocks, and who told David he was pretty. He knew the blue Cortina man who always wanted to come straight away so he could take longer over his second orgasm, who was worried about coming too soon, otherwise, and not getting his fill, who lived in a room with chintz-covered sofas and little lace clothes on occasional tables and breathed very heavily just before orgasm. Once he asked David if he was still on the game, which was strange because he had never offered him any money. He knew the nervous man who had an office next to the estate agents and cockfosters, where they could have sex because he had the key. He called David Tiger because he was so wild, but he was worried when David came across the sensible grey carpet tiles. He had had a tissue ready. David didn't come into tissues. He liked to see his sperm fly. And he knew the thin man. It wasn't that the thin man was so bad. He wasn't. He didn't mean badly. He wasn't dangerous, but he hurt David. He hurt David so badly, David didn't let anyone near his bottom again for a very long time. They never said anything to each other when they met, David and the thin man. That made David respect him. He was obviously a veteran. He obviously wasn't nervous. He turned David round in the cubicle and put his finger up his bottom. David looked at the world through the dirty window at the back of the cubicle that looked over blocks of army flats. He wasn't in control. The thin man wet another finger and pushed David, so he had to bend over. It was like an experiment. It was like going to the doctor. It didn't feel sexy. It was like he was being used. His arse tightened as the man shoved another finger in. He didn't slide it in or feel his way, he just pushed. He was in a hurry and wanted satisfaction. David was just another underage virgin. He wasn't scared of virgins. He knew David wouldn't scream. He watched him coming out of this cubicle with too many men, too many times. He wasn't angry. He wasn't violent. He was just determined. He pushed David further over so his face stared into the toilet bowl, and he was forced to grip the sides with his hands. The rim was damp with piss, spray, and stray pubes stuck to the edge like mementos. David clung on, knowing this was a test. The thin man took out his erection and pushed it into David's arse without even a lick of saliva. David lurched forward as the pain shot up his body. He squirmed away as the man squirmed further in. He howled in anger and outrage and, pulling away, turned to face the thin man. Both their erections had collapsed. David stared at him, swaying slightly with pain and nausea. The thin man stared at him without remorse, without rebuke. Then he just turned and walked out of the cubicle, letting the door bang behind him. Another man tried to push his way in, and instead of slamming the door in his face, David just stood there, trousers at his knees, a tear stain on his face, his eyes staring past the newcomer, past the curious queue leaning against the stained tiles, out to the street and the fresh air, where the thin man had gone. David hated the thin man for the pain he had given him, for the wet feeling between his legs that felt like blood. David hated himself for having bent over so obediently. Most of all, he hated himself because he wanted to run after the thin man and apologize.